So we do have a question already that we're going to start with, and it is, I'm just starting to paint on photos with acrylics and inks. Do you have papers that you think are best for this or not recommended for this?
Yeah, so if you want to augment your prints with paints, acrylics, or watercolors, generally we don't recommend necessarily oil paints because they have solvents in them and those can negatively react with the inks. But any of the matte papers or the matte finish cotton rags. So the LaSalle Photo Matte, any of the Entrada papers, the two Somerset papers, and then you can also paint on the Moen Kopi, the Japanese papers. But basically anything with a matte finish will do really well with pen and ink, pencil, acrylic paint, watercolor, anything else like that. The only difference with watercolor versus a regular art paper is that it's not going to spread out quite as much because of the inkjet coating on the paper. So you might have a little more control with watercolors on an inkjet print than you would with watercolors on just a standard art paper.
And do we have a sample pack that they could try this out on?
Absolutely, we have a sample box. I think I bring it up every time. It's 2 sheets of every paper, and they're all labeled. And then all you have to do is download the color profiles for your prints and go for it. And I think Paige is going to magically drop a link to that sample box into the into the chat so that you can check it out.
Yes, I'm going to post the link right in the chat so you can use that link to find the sample box. And then the next question was, do you have a list of fine art printers that use our papers?
We have a fine art. Yes, we have a where to print on the Moab homepage. So if you go to moabpaper.com and scroll down the bottom, there's a list of printers that offer Moab paper. And they've all kind of been reviewed by us, so they'll take good care of you wherever you're at.
And I will post the link for that in the chat as well.
And then I received an email question yesterday that is another thing that we touch on a lot. This is from Scott. He says, I've been using Juniper for my color images and love the look it provides. Moving to black and white printing and using the Juniper also looks good, but is there a more appropriate Moab paper for black and white? And my answer to that is the Juniper is one of the best Moab papers for black and white. The only thing that some folks might not be super excited about is the Juniper is a little warmer white instead of a bright white. So if you're looking for something that's still kind of glossy, that's more of a bright white, definitely the Slickrock Pearl is one to check out. That's a higher gloss white metallic, so it gives you kind of a third dimension and some depth in your prints. And then if you want to do a cotton rag, a matte paper for black and white, I love the Somerset Museum rag is one of my favorites, although that is now only available in rolls. So if you want to do sheets, the Entrada, especially the Entrada rag textured, is a beautiful paper for black and white. So any of those, Juniper, Slickrock Pearl, Somerset Museum rag, Entrada rag textured.
So we have a question from George. Having a calibrated monitor, a Canon PRO-100 printer, and my sample pack of Moab papers, the only issue I have is a shift of the blues and I'm assuming green sky to magenta.
Greek sky. George is from Greece. He popped into the chat there. He was the first one in, I think. So a couple of questions there. First of all, check and make sure you're using the media setting that we recommend with each paper, because that can cause color shifts. If you're printing on a Mac, I have had a number of folks that I've talked with lately where their printers were added as AirPrint printers instead of using the Canon print driver, which you'll know right away because you won't see all the media setting options and other things, but that really messes up your color. The other thing on the Canon Pro series, the 1000 and then the larger 2000, 4000, 6000, is you do need to do a color calibration from time to time just to keep the ink dialed in. Sometimes that can have an effect. That's less usual. On the Pro 1000, you want to do that calibration with Canon Pro Luster paper. So George, I would say check those things out. And if that doesn't quite answer your question, or if you have other questions, go ahead and shoot us an email. You can email me straight. It's Evan, EVAN, at legionpaper.com, and we can work a little more through that, because often with those color challenges, it can be a mix of things or something else down the line. But very likely a software setting somewhere that you haven't discovered yet.
So John is asking, you mentioned previously that Adobe software is keyed to a D65 white point. I currently print in Lightroom. Is there any reason why I would calibrate my display to D50?
The easy answer is no. If you're working in Adobe products and using their print output, go ahead and calibrate your display to D65. I think all the displays here are calibrated to D65. If you calibrate it to D50, your prints are going to come out looking definitely warmer than the screen, because the D50 is a cooler calibration. So no reason not to calibrate your screen to the D65, which should be the default standard for whatever monitor calibrator you're using.
Barbara's asking, I'm printing images on Entrada double-sided, and the images appear somewhat mottled and are lacking detail. I've reinstalled the ICC profile and the problem persists. They're printing on a Canon 100 Pro.
Yeah, so the first challenge there is that the Pro-100 is a dye printer and not a pigment printer, and dye inks just don't perform as well on matte papers because they don't have the pigment particles that bond with the coating. They're just colored liquids that are optimized for glossy papers. And so the only other thing you can do is, and there aren't many options, I know all of our Pro-100 profiles use matte photo paper as the media setting, so you're probably already using that. The other thing to keep in mind is when you're printing with dye ink on matte papers, especially, you're not going to have the shadow dynamics and the shadow details that you would get on a pigment printer, and the colors will sometimes be a little more muted just because of the way the light reflects off of a matte paper and the dye inks. So chances are you're probably getting the best you're going to get out of that printer on matte paper. The newer Canon dye printer, the Pro-200, is a big jump up from the Pro-100 in overall quality and color and gamut and everything else. If your budget allows, I always recommend a pigment printer just because it gives you the full capabilities across any type of paper. But I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong. I think you're just running up into the limitations of dye ink on that printer.
William is asking about a paper suggestion that would be close to a silver gelatin.
Yeah, in the Moab range, the best paper that's going to be closest to the darkroom would be the Juniper Baryta, mainly because that's Baryta papers have been around coated for darkroom for 40, 50 years. And it's the same coating components and the cotton base with just an inkjet receiver layer on top. So I would say the Juniper Baryta is going to be probably the closest to sort of the air dried fiber papers that you may have used in the darkroom. The Slickrock Pearl is more of a high gloss, so it's going to be a little closer to something like a Cibachrome, but not exactly the same look. It's not that real polished surface. It's got a little bit of kind of semi-gloss to it. But if you haven't tried it, I would start with the Juniper for sure.
What are your recommendations for pre-print sharpening?
That mainly depends on how big of a print you're going to make. So print sharpening I'm not a real strong expert on that, but I do know that generally the smaller prints, 8x10, 11x14, 13x19, even up to 16x24 is kind of when it starts to evolve. But in the smaller prints, especially with a higher resolution camera, you've got so much data there already that the sharpening is kind of what fits your image well. Some people will sharpen a bit more on matte paper just because you get a little more what's called dot gain. So the ink spreads just a little bit more when it hits the paper versus a photo black paper. But there are a couple of good books out there that cover print sharpening in depth and all the different ways to do it and techniques and tricks and that sort of thing. And I would recommend those. And they're over on my bookshelf. So Paige, ask me another question. I'll find the books.
Okay, I'm going to read you this long question. I noticed that color and brightness settings are slightly different between, for instance, Moab 190 bright, I'm assuming the Entrada bright white, in the 5x7 compared to the 8.5x11 sizes. I have to readjust between those two sizes. This is consistent. I can print hundreds of 5x7. They are identical. I can print dozens of 8.5x11, and they are identical between them. But to keep the same appearance, I need to readjust printer profiles between the sizes printing. It seems to be consistent this way between boxes. Same profile required for a given size between boxes, and they're printing with a Canon die printer.
Yeah. So the question there is, no, the paper is not any different. So all these papers are made in master rolls, 50 inches, 60 inches by 1,000, 2,000 feet. And then that's all converted down to sheets and smaller rolls and cards and everything else. So the brightness of the paper is not different, but what's changing is the amount of information that you're putting into that space. So if we look at a print with a gradient, this is kind of the easiest way to explain this. But if, for instance, in here, we've got a gradient in the sky. So it goes from kind of dark brown to very light tan. And on an 8x10, that's about 4 inches. If we put this on a 5x7, that's 75% less space. So this same gradient is going to get compressed into a 1-inch gradient instead of a 4-inch gradient. So when that happens, the appearance of the image changes because you have less space between colors. You have maybe less detail. So it's not that the paper is any different. It's how the ink is applied, and especially with dye ink again on the Entrada, you're getting a little bit more dot spread when the ink hits the paper before it's captured by the coating. So my guess is that if you take that 8x10 image and you print it, part of it on a 5x7, so don't resize the image, but say 5x7 paper, so you're just capturing a piece of it. If you put those next to each other, they'll look identical. But it's just when you're reducing all that data to a print that's 25% of the size, it has a change in visual appearance.
Michael's asking, do most Canon printers use dye-based inks as opposed to pigment-based?
No. So every printer manufacturer, their least expensive photo printer is dye ink, whether it's Epson, Canon, HP. And then the steps up from that are all pigment printers. So for Epson right now, it's the XP 15000 is their little dye printer. Canon right now has two. They have the IP 8720, which is a little 6-color dye printer, and then they have the PRO-200, the new PRO-200, which is a 8 or 9-color dye printer. And the PRO-200 has been a really significant improvement. It puts out really impressive prints on matte and glossy paper, even though it's a dye printer. So that was a really nice update over the PRO-100. And then all the other printers in Canon's line and in Epson's line, the photo dedicated printers, are all pigment ink. So primarily it's pigment ink with just 1 or 2 dye machines.
For Slickrock, does someone choose semi-gloss or glossy?
That all depends on your printer. So when you go to our website and you download your color profile, on that same page in that chart are all the recommendations for media settings. And I know we get a lot of questions about that. So let's go there real quick so I can show everybody. So this is the Moab site, and from the main page, so moabpaper.com, if you roll over ICC profiles, the top option is ICC downloads. Select that. And then if you scroll down just a little bit, first you have to select your printer brand. So we're going to say Canon, and then your model. We've been talking about the 200 and the 300 a lot. So we'll say the PRO-300, that's their new pigment printer. So then in this chart, we have all of the color profiles to download here on the right. On the left are the Moab paper names. And then in the center column here are all the Canon media settings to use when you're printing. So for this printer, if you're printing the Slickrock papers, you're going to select Photo Paper Pro Platinum as your media setting. If we look at a different printer along Canon, it's going to be pretty consistent because that's the media setting that best matches the paper. But go ahead and check, for your printer, take a screenshot of this or print the page or just bookmark it so you always know to come back when you're working on one of our papers to remind yourself of the media setting.
Do you have any opinion about using third-party inks?
So we don't recommend third-party inks, mainly because the ink that your printer manufacturer makes is designed to work in combination with the printer and the print head. So the particle size, the chemistry about it, everything, number one, is designed to work with your printer. Number two, your printer manufacturer inks are consistent. So the ink you bought 2 years ago is going to be chemically identical to the ink you buy 2 years from now. And it's also longevity tested and archivable. So I had a customer email in a couple of weeks ago asking about this ink vendor he had found that was, 90% less than the OEM ink. But if you dig a little deeper, that vendor says, number one, our colors are close, but they're not spot on. And number two, they make no comment anywhere about any sort of longevity or archivability or anything like that. And some searches of photography forums, people were noticing that after 3 months, 6 months, their prints with the cheap inks were already starting to fade. So even though ink seems expensive when you go buy it at the store, there's a lot of engineering behind it and a lot of testing. And when you break it down, on most desktop photo printers, you're only spending $1, $1.25, $1.50 at the most for an 8x10 print. So if you look at it from the per square foot cost of, we'll say $1.25, even though that little ink tank is $15, you're using very little of it every time you make a print. So the only third-party inks that I've spoken with professionals who work with are some of the ones that make a dedicated black and white ink set. So the cone inks, you can replace the tanks in a printer and make it an 8-tone black and white only printer. But those inks are really no cheaper than the OEM inks, and they're longevity tested and all that sort of thing. So do yourself a favor and stay away from third-party inks, because you unfortunately get what you pay for, and it's going to be a big step down from your printer manufacturer's inks.
And I think actually one of our Moab masters, Les Picker, did a full blog on third-party inks that I can post in the chat. So I'll do that.
Nice. Thanks, Les. That's good, because there's a lot of, we always look at it and we think, oh my goodness, it's so much money for ink. But when you parse it out, it's a lot less expensive than it seems.
So the next question from John, can you recommend uses for Slickrock Silver? They have a sample pack with 2 sheets. Mm-hmm. When I soft proof for that paper, it looks pretty unconventional, and I'm wondering what images might look best on this paper.
Yeah, so the challenge with the Slickrock Silver especially is that the soft proof is a little deceptive and it over exaggerates a little bit. So first thing I would do is, if you're soft proofing an image for that paper, is turn off the show paper white or show paper color option, because the silver is such a dark, the machine reads it as almost a dark blue because of the silver. It really throws off the colors. So you can absolutely preview the inks and the gamut changes, but ignore that show paper white, because it's going to really throw it out the window. But keeping in mind that the Slickrock Silver is not a white-based paper, you're best off printing images with a wide contrast ratio that don't require a whole lot of shadow detail, because with that paper, the light has to come through the inks, reflect off the silver layer, and then come back through the inks. So if you're printing a very dark, very dense image, that heavy ink load is going to block a lot of the reflected light. So a lighter, a daylight image or a sunrise or a sunset, as long as the foreground isn't totally blacked out, is going to be a great image for that paper. We've done some beautiful high key portraits on it. Obviously, the things that come to mind are automotive images or other things like that. But it is a versatile paper. You just have to kind of adjust your thinking, because it's not a white-based paper. So if you have those images, night skies or or darker water or things like that, the Pearl is a great paper to go to, the Slickrock Pearl, because that is a white base and it appears brighter with a heavier ink load. So you kind of use both of those in tandem based on the subject of your image.
So are you saying that Slickrock would be better on a dye printer?
No. Slickrock and all of our glossy papers are, I think they're even dye versus pigment. You just will always get a better print on matte paper from a pigment printer.
Got it. What bulbs do you recommend for illuminating framed prints?
My favorite are the high, we've talked about this before, the high CRI LED bulbs where you can specify a color temperature and a beam angle. So CRI is color rendering index, and that's the percent of the visible spectrum that bulb produces. So early LED bulbs a decade ago had a CRI of 75 or 80, which means that you were missing potentially 20% of the colors in your print. So now you can get good LED bulbs that are 94, 95 CRI, which are almost the full spectrum. And you can, if you're in a room that's mostly illuminated by daylight, you can get a more daylight color balance bulb. If you're illuminating a hallway or a gallery room, then you can specify something that's usually about 3,000 Kelvin. And then you can also get your beam angle and everything else. But the nice thing about those LED bulbs is they don't produce heat, they don't produce UV and other things like that that can be long-term detrimental to artwork that you're illuminating.
Michael's asking, what is the purpose of papers that can be printed on both sides?
Yeah, so a number of uses for that. The big two are greeting cards or postcards and books. And then beyond that, if you're doing artwork with it or mounted work, or you're sandwiching it in a lamination that can be seen from both sides. But it's just to give you the option for artistic uses or bookmaking or cards or other things like that.
Can you recommend where someone can learn how to resize an image to prepare it for print? I actually think it might be in one of our previous webinars.
I think we have talked a bit about it. Going back, to a while ago, somebody asked about print sharpening, and I mentioned books, so we can get to that. These books also do mention about resizing images for print. So there's two that I go to a lot. The first one is the Digital Print by Jeff Shuey. That's a very good one. And then Fine Art Printing for Photographers. And these are both pretty dense volumes full of information. You're not going to read it in a weekend, but they're great references for print sharpening, or resizing image, or other things like that you run into. And they're great to have on the shelf in case you come back to working on a project and you think, man, what am I supposed to do with this? They're great references. So that was the Digital Print and Fine Art Printing for Photographers. Those are both books that I recommend that would probably have a lot of information on resizing, and they definitely go really in depth into print sharpening and different ways to do it and all that sort of thing.
Yeah, and if you want to shoot me an email, Paige, Paige @legionpaper.com. I know that it's in one of our previous webinars where you did a very quick demo, but I can definitely find the link to that webinar and send it to you. The next question, when framing prints, can dry mounting to a rising mat board be used with the Juniper, or should they float it?
You can definitely dry mount Juniper. The only recommendation that I have is to try to stay to a low or a medium temperature. The paper is fine in the dry mount press. It's the inks that we try to apply as little heat to as possible. So from conversations that I have, it sounds like if you can keep it to 140, 145 or less, that's going to be your best range. A lot of folks mount at that temperature and haven't seen any image degradation over the years. But yeah, as long as you're mounting an archival paper to an archival board, like the Rising Museum board, that's pH neutral and acid free and all those sorts of things, you shouldn't have any trouble in a dry mount press.
In your experience with top coat spray, protective varnish, if I print and shadow one side only, should I also be spraying the unprinted backside to maintain treatment consistency? They'd like to avoid the expense of the backside if it's not necessary.
Yeah, really the only time that I would say you should coat the back is if you're going to just hang the print sort of on a string and you want it to really last a long time. Because if you're mounting it or if you're putting it in a frame without glass or anything else like that, then you're protecting the back. Because the main thing is when you have just a raw sheet of paper on both sides, it's going to absorb whatever floats by it in the environment. So by spraying the print side, number one, you seal up the inkjet receiver layer. So you've encased the inks in there. And then you also give it some scratch resistance and that sort of thing. But if you're blocking air circulation from the back of the paper in any way, then there's no need to spray the back because you're already giving it that protection. But again, if you were gonna, I don't know, maybe mount it in a multimedia piece or something else like that, then you might want to spray the back because it's remaining available to the environment.
The next question, how important is a specific profile for printing black and white?
Yeah, so we talked about this quite a bit in our black and white webinar. Let me get this in real quick.
Oh, and I can add a link to that black and white webinar.
Yeah, so the biggest thing is there's no sort of wrong answer. So regarding black and white printing, a well-made color profile is just as useful and accurate for black and white work as it is for color work. And that's because it should have neutral grays, and the color profile knows the black point of the paper and the white point of the paper, and so it optimizes all the tones in between. Now, your printer very likely has a black and white mode. So Epson has advanced black and white, and Canon has the ability to say, I want a black and white photo print. And some folks swear that the printer black and white settings are better than using a color profile, and others have totally the opposite opinion. So the best thing to do is take one of your favorite black and white images, print one with the profile and the media setting we recommend, and print one with our media setting recommendation with your printer's black and white setting, and see what looks better. Because it's all about how the print looks and is it as close to what you intended as possible. So no wrong answer, but test both of them and see what works for you. And if you want to really deep dive into black and white, Jim and I did 2 webinars on the topic, converting files, printing, paper selection, all that stuff. And we cover those topics in a lot of depth. And all the webinars that we have posted do in the description have a little table of contents. So if you're looking for a specific topic, you can click right through to the timestamp for your question, and you won't have to, watch through an entire hour to get an answer to a question.
And all of your Q&As have that as well. So if you need a random question answered, it's probably in there.
It's there for you.
Is there a way to print black and white images with the black and gray ink cartridges only without using CMY and other color ink cartridges?
Yeah, so that's going to be the black and white checkbox in the Canon or Epson, generally Epson Advanced Black and White. If you set it to neutral, the difference there is the printer is going to typically use the yellow and the cyan and light cyan inks to extend highlight tones and shadow tones, because at the ink droplet size, we don't see that there's color in there, but it lightens the grays or darkens the grays, and we perceive a wider tonal range. So yes, you can often print without those, but you're not necessarily going to get a better print because you're only using the gray inks.
Are there any situations when you should not use Desert Varnish protection spray? And are there situations when you recommend it should always be used?
Yeah, so first of all, the Desert Varnish is really only intended for matte papers. We don't recommend it on Baryta, Slickrock, Luster, or anything else like that. I know some folks have emailed in and said, hey, I used it on the Juniper and it went really well, but it's not designed for that. So I can't tell you in good confidence, hey, spray the Luster paper because it's probably going to bead up and it's going to look really bad. So first of all, Desert Varnish, use it on the matte papers. And it's really intended in situations where you're not going to be protecting the print otherwise. So if you're laminating, if you have a laminate layer over it, if you're going to frame it behind glass or plexi or other things like that, there's no need to coat it with the varnish because your glass will be providing the UV protection and the environmental protection and that sort of thing. So I definitely recommend it for portfolio books or printed books that are going to get handled. Same thing goes for loose prints in a portfolio box. And to the other attendee's question about, do I need to spray both sides? No, if you have portfolio prints in a box, they're spending most of their time in the dark. Your goal with the varnish is just as you carry it around and the prints rub on each other or people are picking them up, that you won't get thumbprints in the corners or scratches across the print or that sort of thing. So it's the dual purpose of protecting the archivability if you're displaying it without any other kind of protection, or in a book or in a portfolio box where the prints are going to get handled a lot, they'll last longer and they'll keep up their appearance longer if you apply the varnish.
Do you have a recommendation for pigment pens to sign prints on Juniper Rag?
Yeah. We don't necessarily recommend regular Sharpies because of the alcohols and everything else in there. They can kind of spread and that's not great. Your local art supply store should have a recommendation on signature pens for photos or for artwork in general. Obviously, pencil always works, but depending on your situation, pencil might just kind of disappear. It might not be the look you're going for. But I would ring up your local art supply store or your local camera shop, and they should have something in stock that's recommended. I don't have any brands off the top of my head, but you're looking for an archival ink pen that you want to sign the work with.
Would you have to use a different pen for the Entrada as opposed to like the Slickrock?
Not usually. I know for a while we had some Moab archival pens that were Sharpie branded, obviously without the alcohol and the other thing that's in the normal Sharpies. But those worked equally well on photo black papers as matte black papers. Again, if you have one of our swatchbooks or on the margins of your sample box, you can go through and if there's a Juniper, you can sign on that. You can go back to the Entrada, sign on that. Use these not only as visual references for papers, but how do ink pens work with it, or how does my framing mat look, or anything else like that. But yeah, definitely a test and see.
That segues perfectly into Martha's question. Does Moab have a photo paper book to reference their different types of paper to purchase?
Yes. So number one, if you live in a city with a camera store that stocks our paper, they will have either or a 5x7 book of printed images or an 8x10 book of printed images that you can look through. That gives you a real good sense of the paper. If you're not lucky enough to live close to one of our resellers, we do have the lovely Moab swatchbook, which is 4x5 and does have a sample of each paper and then the stats about it behind that. So these I think we have in the office that we can send out to folks if they request it. And then the other thing is if there's a single Moab paper or two that you're really wanting to try, you can email us and we will send you sample sheets of those as well. Or if you're curious in the whole line, I always come back to the sample box because for quite a few sheets, it's a great value. And then you have all the paper there. And whenever you're testing paper with the sample box, I always say use the same photo on different papers. Make sure it's one you really like. Print them all out, and immediately the differences in those papers will jump out to you, and you'll see the ones that you really want to try out. Jacques asked about cyanotype or bromroot process. So with those, you definitely want a matte paper, and generally you want a cotton paper. And I know with some of those, there are certain components you don't necessarily want in the paper base. But for a cyanotype, any of the Entrada papers, or again, the Somerset Museum rag would all be a great option because they're 300-gram cotton sheets. There's some good sizing in there. So they'll take getting wet, they'll take ink application, erasing, things like that. So Entrada or Somerset Museum Rag for the cyanotypes. And how old is our swatch book? Our swatch books are all the same. It's just as papers are added or removed from the line, they'll be added or removed from the swatch book. So Jordan says they've got one that's 2 years old. It should be all the same. Yours might have the dual semi-gloss in it, which has been discontinued recently. But other than that, no, a swatch book that's a couple years old is going to be the same as what we have now.
Yeah, the 2 years should be the same.
Yeah. Where to find a recommendation or make comparison prints between Canon and Epson for 17-inch photo printers. Again, hopefully you live in a spot that has a camera store that has demo printers on site. I know here in Seattle, both Glazers and Kenmore have demo printers where you can go in and bring in an image if you're looking to buy a printer, and they'll make a print on a couple of different printers so you can compare them. If you live out where that's not an option, that's more of a challenge. Maybe if you're a member of a photo club, find out who has different printers and see if they'll make a print for you. It's about kind of using your network and your photo community to help you out when you're making those decisions. I can say, having all the current printers, the Epson and the Canon printers are incredibly similar in output. They both do a phenomenal job. So I couldn't put two prints on the table here and know which printer they came out of.
Matthew's asking, he's planning to apply Desert Varnish to prints in a dusty environment. Are there any precautions that he should be taking?
So first of all, if it's a dusty day and you're applying it outside, you're probably going to get dust on the print, which is going to get adhered to the print with the varnish. The challenge there is the varnish is not really something that you want to apply indoors unless you have a really good vent hood setup or something else like that designed for capturing aerosol application. So I suppose I would say probably morning is going to be less dusty because you've had the cool of the evening and everything's kind of settled. So possibly applying it in the morning. I know that I take prints when I'm coating them, so if I have a paper box, 13 by 19 box lid, I set the print inside the box lid, and that way I can kind of stand it up and spray it. And I've got a clean environment around the print as I'm applying the spray, because when you're applying the spray, you want to go over the edges of the paper. So you're going to start off the page, spray off the page. Otherwise, if you're making a U-turn at the edge of the paper, you're going to put a lot more product in that spot. So as you go off, if you have it laying down, you're going to puff up any dust or anything that's on the surface. So if you set it, inside a paper box or on a big sheet of cardboard, then you're working in a clean area.
I also just posted a video that Les Picker did for us. I posted on our Instagram and our Facebook channel, but I can also post it on YouTube if that's easier. So I will do that. What is the recommended screen brightness?
Yeah, so that depends somewhat on your environment, but the real numbers are you want to be generally between 120 and 160. So all the monitors here I have set to 120 because for my lighting conditions and the printers and everything else, for me, that comes out spot on. Some folks I've talked to, 140 is best. Some people 160. 160 is technically the ISO standard, but for me, it's too bright. So you won't do any harm between, I'd say, 120 to 160 or 110 to 160, as long as what comes out of your printer matches your screen in your viewing conditions. The big thing is you don't want to be brighter than 160 because then your monitor is going to be significantly brighter than your prints. Somebody's asking, what is sizing in paper? Sizing is products or components that are added to prevent the paper from shrinking or expanding when it's subjected to moisture.
Is it best to use spray adhesives or double-sided tape to mount a print onto foam core or cardstock sheets?
I tend to like archival tape just because when you're using a spray, it's very hard to be consistent in how much adhesive you're getting and if you're distributing it evenly and all that sort of thing. I feel like spray adhesives are more likely to fail over a period of time versus a double stick tape or an archival tape. The other thing is a lot of folks use liquid adhesives that you paint on or you roll on, and those are also really consistent because you're not using an aerosol application. So my assumption would lean toward using a double-sided tape. Obviously, make sure that it's an archival tape, or using a roll-on adhesive based on the application you're trying to use.
He's also asking about how to flatten sheets cut from a roll, which you've done in another webinar you showed us with the bubble.
We did. Yeah. So the best way to flatten a sheet is to what we call back roll it. So when it comes out of the printer, it's going to have a curvature to it with the image side on top. And so what you're going to do is you're going to use, typically I use an old roll core because it's a 3-inch diameter tube, and you're going to roll the paper the opposite direction and hold it for a short period of time. Usually 30 seconds is enough. And then when you take it out of there, it comes back to being flat. The thicker the paper, or if it's coated on both sides, it's going to have more of a memory for that roll curl. So you might have to back roll it a little longer. IT Supplies does make a product they call the D roller, capital D roller. And that is a tube with a big cloth sort of sail on it that you can set the print on and then roll it up. So if you're doing a lot of roll printing, that can be a great tool. It's not inexpensive. So if you're just printing off a roll once in a while, it might be a little cost prohibitive, but that's the most professional tool that I've found to back rolling prints.
And feel free to send me an email. I can find the webinar where you demoed it and send the link over to you.
Yeah, and I think I can find the D-roller here real quick too.
So I found that all the papers I've tested, it came down to the texture and or whiteness of the paper for my black and white prints.
Mm-hmm.
The imagery was pretty consistent throughout the pics using the Epson Advanced Black. Am I missing something that should be more obvious?
No. I just put the D-roller link in the chat. No, so the whole goal of different papers is exactly that. What would you like as a white value for the paper? Do you like it warmer white? Do you like it brighter white? And then how does the tonal range change? So a photo black paper will always have richer blacks and more shadow detail than a matte paper, just because a photo black paper or a glossy paper reflects more light right back at us. So we see a little more detail. Whereas a matte paper scatters that reflection a bit more and you don't get quite the same richness in the blacks. So you shouldn't see a huge variation between papers using the same black and white settings, because all you're going to do at that point is you're looking for the differences in the papers. So that's 100% the best workflow for testing papers. And then it's just looking at those prints and deciding what's your goal for presenting your images. Do you want texture or not? Do you want a warmer paper or a brighter white paper? Cotton, cellulose, thicker, transparent, all those other questions. So no, you definitely did the right testing.
What is your recommended and personal favorite Moab paper for black and white?
The Juniper.
For both portraits and for landscape?
Yeah, I love the Juniper because it's a classic look. So I know I say this a lot, but for those of us who started in the darkroom, it's closer to what we're used to. It's a very wide tonal range. It's a slightly warmer paper, but I don't think that's a drawback, because unless you put it right next to a bright white paper, you don't really notice that it's a warmer paper. And it has kind of an organic surface to it that's not, it doesn't look machine made like a luster or a semi-gloss or something like that. If you're looking for a matte paper, then it's the Museum Rag, and you'll hear Jim and I in the black and white webinar talking extensively about Juniper and Museum Rag. They're both our two favorite papers, because the Museum Rag for a matte paper has amazing fine detail and a really nice tonal range, and it really stands up to those images. And then the Juniper is just a fantastic all-around classic look photographic paper.
Someone else did ask where they can find our other webinars. So we keep referring back to other Q&As and other black and white webinars. So I just posted the link to a page on our website that lists all the webinars out. So you can find those on our YouTube channel. There's a link in the chat for those.
And then also, whoops, if you do youtube.com/Moab Paper, that will run you to not just the webinars, but all the other little videos that we've put up. So we'll put both those in there.
All right. Well, I think we got them all. I think I said that again. And now there's going to be a bunch of questions to come. Well, you know where to find us. If you have any more questions, you can always shoot us an email, or we have our next Q&A coming up in July. So save it for that too.
Perfect. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in, and enjoy the week, and we'll see you next time.